Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Pacific Council's webcast on the United Nations and collective action in a changing world. My name is Sumaya Quillian and I'm a programs associate here at the Pacific Council. And we're very delighted to welcome Dilpreet Sudha and Elizabeth Cousens for this discussion. And as a note to our audience, you will be muted and your video will be off for the duration of the webinar, but we really welcome your participation through questions. So we encourage you to click on the Q&A box that you will see at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that at any point during the discussion and submit questions through text. And then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the session where we'll be fielding your audience questions as part of this event. So again, we welcome you to submit questions at any point during the discussion. All you have to do is click on that Q&A box. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dilpreet, who will be moderating this conversation. And I hope you all enjoy the conversation.
Thanks so much, Sumaya, and thank you all for joining us for the Pacific Council's webcast on the United Nations and collective action in a changing world. My name is Dilpreet Sudha, and I'm the Director of International Relations for the City of Los Angeles, and I will be moderating this conversation. We are delighted to welcome Ambassador Elizabeth Cousens, President and CEO of the UN Foundation. Thank you so much for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to speak with us on this topic. Now, for those of you who don't know, Elizabeth has a truly incredible career, one that I've admired as I've myself come from the federal government. Elizabeth Cousens became the UN Foundation's third president and CEO this past January, after serving as the deputy CEO for several years. In her current role, she leads the Foundation's next generation of work to support the United Nations. Before the Foundation, she served for many years at the US mission to the UN in New York, including as the principal advisor and counselor to the permanent representative of the United States to the UN. And she's also served as the US ambassador to the UN Economic and Social Council and alternate representative to the UN General Assembly, where she led US negotiations on the Sustainable Development Goals, something I hope that we'll have a chance to talk about a little more today. Elizabeth has lived and worked around the world in Nepal, the Middle East, Bosnia, Haiti. She was the vice president of the International Peace Institute. She was a Rhodes Scholar, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of her experience. Today's conversation is going to look at how the United Nations and the WHO have helped shape the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how global efforts are connected to local efforts, including work that has directly impacted lives here in the Southern California region. We're going to look at lessons learned from this crisis, innovations that are emerging as a response to the pandemic, and discuss the UN's important role in confronting global challenges that face the next generation of leaders, from climate change to economic inequity. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Ambassador Cousens to give opening remarks. Ambassador Cousens, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dilpreet, and thank you to all of you. It's really wonderful to be able to join you today and delighted to have a chance for a conversation with you all. I thought I'd start by making just 5 framing observations. First, the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored in such a dramatic fashion just how interconnected we are as societies, as economies, as a species. We are truly dependent on each other, whether that is about sharing epidemiological information or about wearing a mask in public. And our ability to prevail over this virus turns directly on our ability to cooperate with each other at every level and to tackle this threat as a common threat. Second, that fact of interdependence is no less true of the climate crisis, the inequality crisis, the democracy crisis, or what many talk about as a trust crisis. We also need each other to get out of those. Third, the systems we have for cooperation, including the United Nations, are in fragile shape. They were in fragile shape for a variety of reasons even before COVID-19, and now they're in acute peril, even as we need them more than ever, and even as they have performed in ways that we often take for granted. So fourth, I want to take you on just a really quick bit of time travel with 3 stops. First, back to 1945. You know, the UN turned 75 years old this year. Think about what the world was like in 1945. Much of the developed world was shattered by war. Tens of millions had been killed or were starving or homeless because of it. More than 50% of the world lived on less than $1 a day, and the average life expectancy at birth was 45 years old. What's more, the world had just suffered through the Great Depression. The idea of human rights barely existed, let alone was respected, and much of the world was still colonized. So it was not a pretty picture. But the shared experience of profound crisis and trauma motivated leading powers of the day to see the strategic interest that they had in cooperation. And it spurred a new commitment among all of them to collective action to improve the human condition and prevent the worst from happening again. So they embarked on that path by creating a whole network of institutions and alliances to rebuild countries after war, to stabilize relations, and to introduce a degree of order and rule to the interaction of nations. Importantly, the countries that created the UN and this whole system around it that we've all grown up with didn't agree on everything. They weren't each other's best friend, but they did agree that their peoples had more to gain from cooperation than from conflict. So they created this network of institutions that would give practical effect to that conviction. And in all the years since, with countries working together, often through the UN, we've gotten some really important things done. So just to name a few, there've been no hot wars between the great powers of the world. Dozens of countries became newly independent. That's how the UN grew from 50 in 1945 to 193 today. Human rights are universally recognized, even if it's obviously a tremendous fight to live up to them. Smallpox was eradicated. We're close to eliminating polio. The hole in the ozone was closed. Extreme poverty is down dramatically. There are a lot of successes that we can chalk up to in significant part, the framework of cooperation that was created after 1945. So jump next to 2015. This is 5 years ago. The world came together again in 2015 to chart a global path toward a better future, this time not driven by crisis, but buoyed by gains that had been made in the previous generation, largely by just the lifting of the overall global economy, the hundreds of millions of people who had been lifted out of extreme poverty in a generation. Millions of lives that had been saved by vital health interventions for mothers and children in the previous decade or so. The track record of ending wars and building peace, not everywhere, but not nowhere. And that's when the world adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, as you all know, and Dilpreet alluded to, an agenda for progress that put people first and made a promise to leave no one behind. And every country on the planet endorsed them, and that was just 5 years ago. Some surely did that with fingers crossed behind their back, but the SDGs were nonetheless a public promise that governments around the world made to each other and to their citizens. Now, fast forward, we're in 2020, and we're in the middle of this once-in-a-century pandemic, and we are fighting to survive while everything we try to hold on to for stability seems to elude our grasp. COVID-19 is a global health emergency, but it is obviously also an inequality emergency, a human rights emergency. It's an all of society emergency. It's exposing every weakness we have and poses disproportionate risk to those already vulnerable to being left behind. It's essentially showing us the best and the worst of ourselves. And it's especially forcing us to confront the true value of solidarity and leadership, how much we can do when we have it and how much we suffer when we don't. So my fifth and last observation is to go back to the earlier point about a system in peril, but to point to some bright spots and what I genuinely believe is both a historic opportunity to reimagine what international cooperation looks like for the future, as well as what and whom international cooperation is for. So while COVID-19 has led to a global reckoning that is being felt in every community, it's also creating a new moment for all actors, especially those that have not traditionally been part of the multilateral system, to show leadership and step up. And they're doing that in remarkable ways. This is a time when subnational actors are really rising to the challenge. Cities like Los Angeles, states, businesses, organizations, alongside and often in partnership with global actors like the United Nations. And I'll say more a little bit later about some of the work that we've been doing with the World Health Organization around COVID, but you can see it in other areas as well, notably including climate change, also equity and other issues. And it didn't start with COVID, it started before. So just to conclude, at the beginning, we face enormous global challenges. They're felt so deeply worldwide. They're experienced so acutely locally, because that's where people live. And this can be a real time for new and creative coalition building within and across societies and sectors. I think that's part of the vision that the Secretary General actually has for the UN of the future. He calls this an inclusive and networked multilateralism that we need to build. And I'm convinced that it is essential both to see ourselves through this hard time, but especially to build a better future based on common interests and a wider spectrum of common interests and the conviction that our destinies are ultimately shared. So I'm looking very forward to speaking with all of you, leaders from the Los Angeles community. And Dilpreet, I'll close with that and look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Ambassador, I think that framework of international cooperation that you laid out is really helpful, taking stock of the progress that we've made and also looking at, how this current crisis is showing, revealing even more so the fragility and kind of the shortcomings of that cooperation. So picking up on that, I want to look a little bit more about who are the protagonists and partners in this new kind of shift and paradigm shift that we need to undergo. You assumed your role just this past January after having served at the organizations since 2015. And I take it this is not how you envisioned your first 6 months on the job. We're facing a crisis of a magnitude not seen in a century, all while the United States federal government is dangerously derelicting its duty domestically and its leadership globally. At the city level, what I've seen is our supply chains break down. We're seeing PPE and medical equipment shortages and a general lack of coordination at the national level across borders. But meanwhile, the philanthropy sector has stepped in to fill this void, to help flatten the curve and address the inequities that this crisis is really revealing. In fact, you immediately leapt into action. I understand you raised well over $200 million to benefit the WHO's response to the crisis, just as President Trump was announcing defunding the WHO in the middle of a global pandemic. So my question is, how are you, through your leadership, meeting this unprecedented moment at the UN Foundation? Who are the partners and protagonists you're working with as you combat this crisis? And to what degree has this crisis forced your institution to innovate or change its approach to fundraising, funding, partnerships, and long-term strategic planning?
Well, thank you. And it is safe to say 2020 looks different for all of us. This was supposed to be the super year where we were kicking off the countdown, the last decade of the Sustainable Development Goals, heading into an incredibly important year for climate and the environment. So like everybody, we're reeling and trying to shift gears in whatever way is most relevant and can be the most impactful. Like everyone, we've gone virtual, we've shifted programs, we're looking at all kinds of implications for our work. But one of the things we did, as you mentioned, we made an early decision to do everything we could to help the World Health Organization in its effort to lead the global public health response to COVID-19, which we felt early this year and certainly still now is an absolutely essential component of the overall response that's needed within communities across countries to prevail over this virus. We've done that principally by creating something called the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund, which has been a large and early part of the UN Foundation's response to the pandemic. We created the fund at the request of the World Health Organization, and we did it in partnership with a foundation based in Switzerland, the Swiss Philanthropy Foundation. And it's a new kind of fund. It's the first of its kind that allows at scale for non-traditional donors, basically meaning anyone who's not an official sovereign donor, to pool resources to support the most urgent needs in COVID-19 response as carried out by the World Health Organization. It's guided by an overall plan that WHO has, something called the Strategic Preparedness and Response Plan. And this is the only way that companies, organizations, even individuals can directly contribute to the frontline response of the World Health Organization and its partners. And the response has just been overwhelming. I mean, we thought we'd be lucky after we launched the fund if we maybe raised $50 million. And within a few months, we've raised, as you said, over $224 million. And it comes from an incredible diversity of sources. Over 140 leading companies and organizations and foundations, and almost 500,000 individuals from more than 100 countries have contributed to this fund. We've tapped virtually every tool we could find, from virtual concerts to online gaming to donor-advised funds to point of sale donations, employee giving, and just online platforms for giving. The gifts range from $3 to $10 million. it's been just really so humbling and such a privilege to be able to provide a vehicle for people who wanted to be able to give in this way. And there's so many different ways that people are contributing to COVID response. But for those who wanted to be able to give financially, this gave them a vehicle to do so directly and against the most urgent needs that the WHO had. We've also been able to move it out the door quickly. So, and I think for those of you who've had some exposure to emergencies, you know that fast money is more important than bigger, slow money. So being able to get funds scaled up and out the door quickly has been really crucial. So just to give you a couple of examples, WHO's earliest purchases of bulk commodities to distribute where there's greatest need. So that's personal protective equipment, it's test kits, it's lab reagents, it's things like that, were purchased through this fund. Until the vaccine summit a month ago, hosted by the United Kingdom, this fund was the single largest donor to the World Health Organization's COVID response. So you just think about that. Like you think about the indices of the biggest donors to different public health needs, or in this case to COVID response from WHO, a group of nearly 500,000 individuals, organizations, foundations, and businesses had that kind of weight early on. And it's really been consequential because it's been able to get early money out for R&D, the PPE, early training in multiple languages of healthcare workers around the world. So it's been really, like I say, a very humbling and privileged position to be in, to be able to create something like that and just provide a vehicle for people to have that kind of impact.
Fantastic. I just want to remind our audience that they can go ahead and begin submitting questions. I have a few more for Ambassador Cousens, but feel free to go ahead and submit your questions via the Q&A tool at the bottom of your video. And you can feel free to identify yourself in the question. And we're going to turn to your questions very shortly. Speaking of all these actors, particularly individuals, philanthropy, I want to highlight another kind of actor in this crisis, and that is the subnational authorities, local authorities, essentially cities and states that are really at the forefront of combating this crisis on the ground, from obtaining PPE for essential workers to issuing stay-at-home guidelines for their residents, to providing direct financial relief to support our most vulnerable community members. For example, in Los Angeles, we're providing financial support to those that have been excluded by the federal government because of their immigration status. We've set up testing sites and on and on. And so, more and more we're seeing mayors and governors leveraging their own international partnerships that they've developed to respond to global challenges in real time. And this goes beyond just this moment of coronavirus, but we were seeing this already with climate change as well as local implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. But in cities, we know we could do our jobs a lot better and a lot faster and at scale, as you just mentioned, if we had more support from national and international actors, a whole of government, whole of society vision that includes civil society, the private sector, philanthropy, and critically the international community of states and multilateral actors. So how, if at all, do you see this crisis, the COVID crisis, creating an opening for sustained dialogue between and collaboration between the UN and local governments? Is there a future in which local governments have a formal voice in the multilateral system to address global challenges?
Well, in short, yes, and you have to have a voice. So exactly how we do it is something we'll all need to do together. But I think the first thing is just to underscore how crucial it is that we take a more diversified approach to understanding who the stakeholders are in the international system and find ways to connect every level of response in a meaningful way, not just with respect to COVID, but with respect to so many other collective challenges that we face, including notably climate, but others as well. And I think, the role of cities and local actors is just so crucial. It's crucial on every front, but you really see it so palpably in a crisis like this. You and my deepest respect to you and all of your colleagues who are going through this and bear that responsibility of having to work with your constituents and all of your citizens in a way that meets their needs when they're facing so much hardship and vulnerability. You're really on the front lines of responding to this. And so that's something we need to be able to elevate in a way that reinforces the sort of work that you're doing, gives you the sort of arms and legs and leverage that you need, and vice versa. I think seeing the sort of work that I know you're doing in LA to learn across cities I understand, you convened a virtual assembly early in March, the mayor did, of mayors from every region of the world to share solutions and advice. That kind of learning across borders, where we're seeing that it matters more if you're a city of a certain size than necessarily even what country you're in. Really being able to share some of those, everything from protocols to policy responses to ways that you can give one another support and advice, I think is so critical. Cities have also been showing up, and because LA is so much in the forefront of this in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we've seen incredible dynamism from cities in every part of the world showing up to talk about how they're using that framework as a way to meet the needs of their constituents. And it really is, at the end of the day, and this is for you to say more than me, but I think that's what's so powerful, because you are at the closest point of direct service to your citizens. And so seeing what's meaningful and resonant to them, drawing from these international frameworks, what is going to be powerful in helping you meet their needs. That's what they're for at the end of the day. They're not just there as to be frameworks for people to appreciate. They're to be of value to real people in real places. So I think there's a very, very powerful role for cities, for states, for other, subnational entities, working also with the business community, with local philanthropy, and other organizations to play a very different kind of role. Obviously, what you're doing in your own domain, but also on the international stage. And to me, that's one of the most, kind of exciting arenas to look at when we think about the evolution of how international cooperation and collaboration takes place. We need some national governments to catch up to you.
I know this is a conversation with you, and our audience wants to hear from you, but I just wanted to share two things that just came to mind as you were speaking. One is, Los Angeles adopted the SDGs locally, and we submitted a voluntary local review to the UN. So nation states do a national review, and we did our own voluntary review along with New York and many other cities around the United States, because we see it as a fantastic way to get a sense of where we are in terms of indicators, and see where the gaps are, so we can really address those gaps and formulate policies around that. For instance, with the racial justice movement that has swept the United States and the world, that's something that we are now really putting a lot of effort and focus onto, is using the SDGs as a lens for our racial justice work to make sure that we are able to track and then capture the data around racial justice and see where we need to put more funding and resources. You mentioned Mayor Garcetti hosting a virtual conference with other mayors around the world to share best practices. That's something we're doing not just on COVID, but other issues, for example, climate change, through the C40 network. And just this morning, I was very privileged to be on a call with the Mayor's Migration Council, and we were joined by the Director General of the International Organization of Migration. So I see a real shift in the dialogue between UN agencies and cities, and really looking forward to seeing how this current moment shifts the way we work moving forward. We do have one question, a quick question from an audience member on where we can send money to donate to the WHO. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you have that website handy.
COVID-19responsefund.org.
Thank you.
No, and happy to share also information with the council, and they can circulate that in any way that's useful.
Great.
That's wonderful. I love that kind of question.
It looks like we might be getting more donations to this fund, which, as we can see, are still very much needed. Just a reminder that you can go ahead and submit questions, audience members, and I'll ask one more. This will be my final question. We'll turn to our very engaged audience. So as we learn to live with COVID-19, and we're beginning to reimagine what our societies look like moving forward, and what an equitable, just economic recovery looks like, how can we help empower future generations to take on critical issues like climate change, education, human rights?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is that I don't think we will get ahead of those issues if we don't empower that generation. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to figure out meaningful ways to do that. And that's about everything from inviting young people in meaningful ways into decision-making contexts, it's giving them the tools and the empowerment to be able to play those roles. And it's really taking their voices seriously as shapers of their own future. And so that is another arena of, I think, really important, generative, significant change that's needed at every level, frankly, but on the international as well as the national. We have over 1.2 billion young people who are 15 to 24 years in the world today. They're over 16% of the global population, the largest generation of young people in history. There is no way to make our future sensibly without deeply engaging that generation. We obviously see what impacts COVID alone is having on them. And won't even get into climate, though we can get into climate. But just thinking about the impact on the world's students, 90% of the world's students are being impacted by school closures. And the trade-offs are so tough, right? And we all see it, whether we're parents, whether we're city officials, or we're school administrators or teachers. Children are just suffering disproportionately in many parts of the world, including here in the United States, from insecurity, from the economic toll of this crisis, from hunger. Hunger is doubling as a result of COVID, according to the UN's latest estimates. So significant pressures, and especially on young people. But we've also seen how young people can, here at home and globally, can inspire, drive, and I desperately hope and believe will sustain global movements for change, whether it's on climate action, LGBTI rights, or racism. So, we have a young generation who wants the kind of world that, frankly, we all want to live in, that they deserve to live in, and we need to live up to their highest and best hopes and aspirations. So to me, that's a very, it's exciting. It's also a real imperative, and it's a challenge to people as old as me to take that really seriously and do what we can to create those entry points in a very real way. I'll just say one last thing. We do quite a lot of work, the UN Foundation, through a sister organization called the Better World Campaign, with US constituencies around the US position in the world and US support for the United Nations. And we do a lot of work with millennial and Gen Z Americans, and we do quite a lot of polling of them. And we, in the last poll that we did last year around all of the issues we're talking about, whether it's poverty, human rights, climate change, or the environment, 92% of that cohort agreed that they wanted to act on the behalf of the most pressing issues in the world today, and to do so in collaboration with each other and with other countries. That's a really powerful vote of support for the kind of foresight that, frankly, the leaders who created the UN in 1945 also had. So that, to me, gives me a lot of hope.
Great. We have some fantastic questions from the audience. Our first one is from Mara Youssef. Thank you, Mara, for your question. Mara's question is, how can regular citizens advocate for and engage our local and federal government to take a diversified approach in promoting other issues, like the uptake in gender-based violence during COVID on a global scale?
Well, first is to speak out. Write your congressperson, talk to your neighbors about this. I think one of the things that I'm finding, and I think we're all seeing, is that people gain so much strength when they see that they are in community with others. And so any effort that you can make as an individual, whether you're doing it in your family, your community, your faith community, again, reaching out to your elected officials. I am more than happy to suggest any number of advocacy organizations, and there are so many that you can work through and with. The agenda is so crowded right now. I think that's the one challenge where the global agenda is crowded, the domestic agenda is just convulsed by everything people are dealing with on the health front or the economic front. But it's really important and so crucial that the kinds of issues you raised get elevated in that context. And I do think part of the path out of this crisis is going to be by focusing on some of these really critical issues of rights and equity. So to me, it isn't a trade-off. It's actually very mutually reinforcing. And thank you for the question.
Our next question is from Todd Snyder, who is the founder of Lost Faces of Humanity Foundation. Thanks, Todd, for your question. Todd asks, has the UN offered any advice with domestic leaders on our homeless crisis? Los Angeles, as you know, is struggling with something like 58,000 homeless residents in the county. So how can the UN help with this domestic crisis, especially based on its experience with UNHCR and its work with IDPs, internally displaced persons?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. So, I mean, it's interesting. The UN is often seen as an entity that orients itself out there. And so it's an interesting question to think about how it can be a helpmate in facing some of the really significant domestic challenges that we face. I do think the SDGs are a part of that, and they're a part of this story because they are they're a common language that knits together what different cities are facing or communities are facing, and then can create all kinds of opportunities for policy exchange and ways of learning and supporting one another. The UN also has, as you mentioned, it has an organization, the High Commissioner for Refugees, that works on issues of displacement. The International Organization of Migration is another one that you were just speaking to earlier this morning. UN Habitat works on issues of housing and shelter and ways to support people who are often in their most vulnerable. I also think the arrow can go the other way, though. I mean, as you're confronting such a significant challenge with homelessness, and other cities are as well, what you're learning and experimenting with and finding works or doesn't work is such an asset for other parts of the world. So, I'd be interested in also hearing, I don't want to put Dilpreet on the spot, but where you see those kinds of platforms for collaborative learning. The UN can often be that kind of platform and is available essentially to anyone who wants to use it. So that's really part of its core purpose, less to kind of come in with advice, but often to provide that space where different stakeholders can come together and strategize and craft solutions together.
Wonderful. Our next question is from Mariah Tafoya. Mariah asks, what, if any, lessons learned do you see from how the UN Foundation and the WHO responded to COVID? So what are some of the key lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, one is it's really good to have friends in a foxhole. I think, we've been working with the World Health Organization as the whole UN system for 20 years, and we've had a particularly close relationship with WHO because of some early work we did on a whole variety of health concerns going back to the beginning of the foundation. And we built up quite a really high level of trust and kind of mutual knowledge. So it's one of the things that allowed us to move quickly, because we had those relationships. So when they called in late February and said, we think we need a way to be able to channel whatever generosity is out there to help support our work, we were able to understand exactly what they needed and meant and to move quite quickly. And so there's a certain lesson that's just about cultivating relationships of trust that allow you to move swiftly when you need to. You hear people sometimes say change moves at the speed of trust. I think that was one of the lessons we drew from this. I think another one is just being able to move with agility. People don't always think about the United Nations as being an agile organization. They don't think of foundations as being agile necessarily either. And sometimes we're not, but in this instance, we were able in both cases to do that and to kind of help each other do that, which I think is another lesson about, frankly, beyond this emergency, ways that all of our institutions are going to have to adapt to a world that really cycles through change and challenge quite quickly. So that's another one. And, the last I'll just say, and I kind of started with it when you asked me initially about the fund, maybe it's not a lesson, but it's just an insight, is seeing how much extraordinary generosity there is out there. I mean, in the very beginning when we launched the fund, one of the first things we did was set up a Facebook donate page. And I would scroll, whenever I was having a dark day, I would scroll through the feed of people donating to the fund. And it was everything from people were giving $3. People were saying, I was going to go to the movies. I can't go to the movies. I'm giving my movie money to this fund. People were expressing solidarity for what at the time were the areas hardest hit. Italy was one of them. There was outpouring of solidarity and to places that were being particularly hard hit at the time. And it really is just a remarkable lesson to me of what I think most people really want to do and be in the world, and what they're capable of at their best. So that's what I draw from it.
On that last point, in Los Angeles, the Angelinos on the call will know the mayor, in partnership with some of our philanthropic partners, established something called the Angelino campaign. And it essentially was soliciting donations to help the most vulnerable. And we raised over 100 million that we were able to give out to people below the poverty line that had lost their jobs due to the crisis on prepaid debit cards. And we saw this similar phenomenon where you see people donating just small amounts, and to see how that was able to build up to $100 million and really make an impact. And I think what's interesting about this crisis, which has been described as, you know, the great leveler, is some of these ideas that were considered kind of controversial, like a universal basic income, are really being piloted around the world in a lot of different cities. And you know, other you know, topics like universal healthcare, which in the United States seemed to be like a very difficult topic, are now becoming more mainstream, because we know that no one is safe until everyone is safe, at least with a public health crisis.
No, when we don't have the systems to put a floor under the most vulnerable, frankly, in any country. Maybe a few in certain northern hemisphere, but they're really, it's a real challenge to most countries around the world. And I think is something we really need to work on in a very, very serious way. The idea of consigning large segments of the human population to something below a floor, that just is kind of insupportable, and we're seeing it so dramatically played out right now. So I hope this will really stimulate exactly that kind of fresh thinking, where people get past some of their old neuralgias and really think about what it means to be humane societies that treat people well and with dignity and respect, and try to find ways to help them, you know, thrive in a very, very tumultuous world.
Our next question, which is a question I had, so I'm really grateful to Scott Chamberlain for asking this, is how has COVID-19 road tested the Sustainable Development Goals? And are they proving to be a good framework to usefully orient the world community when the rubber hits the road? And I would just add, you know, based on what you've seen so far, is this something we're going to need to revisit, or you know, are they still just as relevant to us today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually think they're even more relevant, but we were not on track. So we were coming into 2020 not on track for the SDGs. And I think, you know, there was a recent report the UN just came out with last week that goes through kind of goal by goal, even before COVID, what the trend lines were. And there was some progress in some areas, but frankly, there was stagnation in others, and there was backsliding in some. So, and it plays out differently in different places, but that doesn't make the agenda less relevant. It just means we need to accelerate and get more strategic about how we're trying to move it forward. I think COVID just underscores how relevant a framework it actually is. So think about some of the targets. Look, if we had universal health coverage and universal health care, we would be in a vastly different place for a lot of the world's people. If we had access to clean water for the people around the world who don't have it, they would be able to do the kind of hygiene that we're recommending to everyone in our own communities. If people had basic shelter, if they had a kind of basic floor underneath which they weren't able to fall in terms of poverty, all of that would put us in a much stronger place as individual societies and collectively. So to me, the SDGs has to be at the heart of not only our response strategies, but especially our recovery strategies coming out of this crisis. And, you know, think about the kind of core logic of the SDGs. At the end of the day, it's about leaving no one behind. It's basically an equity-driven agenda that says, you know, all of these issues intersect. Even some of the ecological dimensions of the SDGs would significantly affect our vulnerability to viruses that crisscross from animals to humans. So I think it's more relevant than ever, but we have an opportunity now to put new fire in our belly under how we go forward in these next 10 years coming out of this situation. And I know it's going to be a while before we come out of this. We're still deeply, deeply in it. You know, we're in the emergency even while we're having to think about the recovery and lay the seeds and groundwork for that too.
Our next question is from Janelle Coronado. Janelle asks, what were some of the challenges and dynamics navigated in working with these international institutions to build your COVID-19 fund, particularly in a climate of withdrawal from the international community?
Well, our work with the WHO actually, was remarkably seamless, and I think it did have to do with a sort of shared history of working together, and frankly, the leadership that WHO was showing in how it was trying to respond as quickly and as pragmatically as possible. So, just as an example, some of the earliest allocations from the fund were not to WHO. It was they made the call, but they made an early call to tranche out some funds to other organizations that were doing what they felt was some of the most urgent work. So some of that went to an entity called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations on some of the early R&D work. Some of it went to UNICEF for work in some of the most vulnerable communities and with mothers and children around the world. Some of it went to the World Food Program, which stood up early on what they were calling solidarity flights. They used their logistics infrastructure to get some of the shipments of personal protective equipment and lab tests and emergency personnel to places around the world. So in that sense, that worked quite well. I think what you're asking is a bit about the U.S. position and retrenchment from international engagement in different contexts, including the World Health Organization. And frankly, I think we all suffer for that. We all would be benefited from having sustained U.S. leadership at the World Health Organization and in the international system writ large. The U.S. has such a long-standing bipartisan tradition of leadership on a lot of issues, but foremost among them, global public health. And to see that stepped away from is really tragic. And it's, to me, in my mind, also extremely dangerous. And it's just unnecessary. For those who have misgivings or concerns about some of the early steps that WHO took, and I know many good people who do, and that's, fair enough. We will learn all kinds of things about what could have been done differently or better early on. The WHO has now launched an independent panel to do an independent evaluation of everybody's response on COVID-19. It's being led by two exceptional world leaders, Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Ellen Sirleaf-Johnson, the former President of Liberia, and they will be nothing if not rigorous and extremely tough on everybody, and they should be. So, I think just to say, I think it's a real shame that we're seeing the United States leave the field of play in an area that they are desperately needed, because U.S. leadership has been so consequential and so valued in the global health arena and so many other areas as well. But we are doing our best in the absence of it.
Our next question is from Pak Lim. How can the UN best coordinate with national governments on supporting migrant workers, among the most vulnerable groups impacted by the pandemic, and a group impacted by cross-border issues? And if I may just add, in Los Angeles, a huge majority of our healthcare workers and our essential workers are immigrants, and many whom send back remittances back home. And so how this crisis affects our migrants and those remittances, and how that then causes issues in those countries of origin, exacerbates this economic crisis that we're seeing.
Yeah, no, it is a really good question. I mean, some of what the UN does is to shine a light and make sure that those communities and those populations are at the forefront of people's concerns. Some of it has to do with joining meetings like Dilpreet obviously had this morning, where you have real strategizing and sharing of solutions across international platforms and local ones. So in different parts of the UN system are very engaged with issues related to migrant rights beyond COVID, certainly, whether it's the human rights machinery, it's the International Organization for Migration, or just calling out the circumstances of migrants and migrant workers in the context of everything else the UN is trying to do. So, and that's something you will see everyone from the Secretary General to other leaders of the UN system, I think, do regularly, because they carry with them such a conviction that part of their job is to sound the clarion call about leaving no one behind. So if there are communities or populations that are particularly vulnerable, they take a disproportionate interest in calling that out and trying to do what they can to support solutions.
Our next question is from Anonymous. Fantastic question. What work and initiatives does the UN Foundation lead to promote racial justice for communities domestically and abroad?
Yeah, no, well, it's a great question. And it's something we are, as an organization, like many organizations, looking at ways that we can strengthen and invest in further in the years ahead. We do a fair amount of work domestically through our different campaigns. We run a number of different campaigns in the US that are oriented toward global issues, but that engage the values on behalf of which the UN system was created. Principal among those is an opposition to racism and a commitment to equal rights and equal justice. So we work through our UN Association of the United States. We have a nationwide network of largely campus chapters of the UN Association who are very engaged in campaigning and writing to their congresspeople. We have other campaigns that work similarly. And then we're looking now at ways that we can do even more in the work we do on the SDGs and the work we already do in climate justice, obviously in the work that we're doing in relation to COVID-19, to make sure that opposition to racism and looking at real issues of equity very deeply are factored quite integrally into our work. And it's something you see the UN grappling with too, in a way that it can do even more than it has historically done. So, I mean, the UN has a long-standing track record and tradition of opposition to racism in all kinds of contexts, and I think is now looking at ways that they can live that even more fully and concretely in every domain.
I'm thinking back to your comments earlier about the interconnectedness that this crisis is showing us, and just seeing the Black Lives Matter movement, truly just spread across the country, around the world, was just truly remarkable, and really underscored that this is a global issue, and that we all need to do much more. Our next question is from Carol Hamilton, who congratulates you on what you've been able to accomplish in your work with the foundation. Carol was the public delegate in 2014. She says, we both saw the success of the UN, led in part by the US, in curbing the Ebola crisis that year. What are some of the ways in which you've been able to apply lessons learned from the Ebola crisis as you deal with the current COVID crisis?
Yeah, it's nice to hear from you. And it is, I think often about that period, which was really a display, I think, of really phenomenal leadership and genuine solidarity. Part of how all of that coalition came together, for those who may not have watched it as closely, was a deep dedication of the US government to recognizing that we needed a collective and comprehensive effort in which we were arm in arm with the countries the most affected. And we worked extremely closely as a government with Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria, and others to try to mount the sort of support that was needed to counter the Ebola crisis. One of the things that we did was to bring up the then head of the CDC for a private briefing of every delegate to the United Nations, because our permanent representative at the time, having just had a very concerning briefing that laid out the curve we clearly needed to bend, sitting in the White House Situation Room, said this is information that every country ought to have. And if they had that, then they would understand, and we would all be able to mount a collective response that we needed. And that was one of the really remarkable displays of leadership at that time that I've often thought back to. What we take from that now, and I think what a lot of the global public health community takes from that are all the lessons that did come out of the Ebola crisis. Some of which have been acted on and used to strengthen different parts of the global health system, and some of which haven't fully been acted on, and we're paying a bit of the price for it. So, but there is a lot of just deep commonality of understanding across that community about what kinds of responses are needed now, and people are drawing on that reservoir of work and experience, and also, as I mentioned earlier, kind of a degree of trust, which is extremely helpful.
Great. Those are all the public questions we have at the moment from the audience. I think I would like to kind of wrap up before I give the floor back to you to share any closing thoughts with us. This is the 75th year anniversary of the United Nations. The UN General Assembly for the first time is not taking place in person. We are all at home. we are talking through Zoom. What are you doing, or what have you done to help you cope during this time of being at home and working from home? And yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, it's a great question, and I feel like we should have an open chat room, and I'll share what we're all doing to cope. I mean, and I'll say, it's we are all facing the same kinds of challenges of this virtual work, and the work-life balance that is so challenging to strike. I will say, I think in the UN context, and also in our experience, one of the real values of this is that it completely takes away geography as a rate limiter of engagement. So we can now have much more inclusive conversations when we used to say, well, if people couldn't make it to New York during the General Assembly, or, oh, if they can't be physically based here, that's just erased. So you do have time zones to worry about, and you have bandwidth challenges occasionally, but you have a much greater capacity to diversify the voices you hear, the partners you engage with, the challenges you get from different constituencies. So that's actually a really, to me, an exciting dimension of a really terrible time, which has got so much hardship in it. But it does actually open up a new kind of space for a different kind of political engagement and just genuine dialogue that I think diplomats are struggling a bit with this kind of mode. It's hard to negotiate in this context, and so trying to figure out what that's all about. But there is this really significant upside that I believe deeply we will not lose. We will find a way to harness, and that to me is really quite inspiring. I also do a lot of cooking, and I watch a little bit too much TV, as I'm sure a lot of people do. But I get to do it with my son, and I have to say, one of the things that I feel just so lucky about is, I'm obviously very lucky that we have a home, that I'm employed, and all of those things that so many people are without. But being able to spend true time and more time with my family, I do find to be a real source of energy.
Thank you for sharing that. And I will turn the floor back to you if you had some closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap up here. It was a fantastic conversation and really great questions from the audience. And we were able to cover 10 questions, which is, must be some sort of Zoom record, I would think, for a webinar of this kind.
Well, first of all, just thank you to you for moderating and for being my partner in crime in this conversation, which has been just terrific, and for all the wonderful questions. My one regret is that I can't see everybody, so I would love to be able to see who all is on the line, but it's been really wonderful to have this conversation with all of you. I feel like I would like to pose a bunch of questions back. And maybe we could find a reverse way to do that at some point in the future. But I guess I would just, underscore some of the themes that we touched on earlier. The first is just about the dynamism and leadership at the local and community level, whether that's sitting in the mayor's office, whether it's in the business community, or it's in your own larger internationally minded community in Los Angeles. There is tremendous power in that. There's great, intellectual leadership in that, and any ways to surface it and bring it into the international arena in ways that we can be helpful with, would be really thrilled to do it, because I think that is going to be a lot of the lifeblood of some of the solutions that we need and the coalitions that we need for the work we need to do next. Second, I guess I would just underscore this whole point of solidarity. You as a city and as a community are known for that. And I feel lucky to have been born there. It's been a long time since I've lived in Los Angeles, but you are a very open-hearted city in all of your work and policies and practices. And I think that is also a really significant model for others. And I hope that you will keep engaging in all kinds of international arenas, as I know you're already doing with great leadership and impact. And last, I guess, would just say to all of you listening, if you want to find ways to be engaged, whether it's with the COVID response or on broader international issues, anything you can do to reach out to your representatives, to speak about the value that you place in international cooperation, in US leadership in the world, in the kinds of ways that we need to tackle the challenges that are on our collective agenda that so require kind of the sinews of cooperation, and trust and confidence. Anything that you all can do, you're all influential leaders in your own spheres. And I think that's so important to find ways to kind of testify to that in different ways right now. This is just an incredibly open moment in our history as a nation. It's an incredibly open moment in the world. It could go in different directions. So every step we take, every time you raise your voice, it will matter. And I just want to thank you for what I know all of you already do in your communities, and for anything more you can do. I think the world will thank you for it. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Learned so much in this conversation, and I'm leaving thinking about silver linings and blessings, and the work we can do together as a community at the global level. So thank you so much. Thanks to our engaged audience, and thank you to Pacific Council for hosting. There are tons of other events that Pacific Council is hosting over the next week at their virtual summit. Speakers include Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Lieutenant Governor of California Lenny Kounalakis, another former U.S. ambassador, Congressman Maxine Waters. So all that programming can be found on Pacific Council's website. And thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Great to be with you.